Hey everybody, this is an entry from Robert J Alexander's History of International Trotskyism book. The title is U.S. Trotskyism, the Shachtmanite Split. The most serious split which U.S. Trotskyism had so far experienced began to develop in mid-1939 and reached its climax during and after the Socialist Workers Party Special Convention in April 1940. It gave rise to a schismatic Trotskyist group, which was a major element in the U.S. far left for almost 2 decades and in attenuated form continued into the 1980s. The split in the Socialist Workers Party took place in 1939 to 40, involved as leaders of the rival factions the two men who had been principal leaders of U.S. Trotskyism since the establishment of the movement, both of whom were major figures in the Fourth International, James P. Cannon and Max Shachtman. Cannon and Shachtman's rivalry in this conflict had some roots in personality differences and disagreements dating from the start of the movement, but also involved theoretical and ideological differences, which then constituted major issues in world Marxism-Leninism and continue to do so more than 4 decades later. The 1939 to 40 split was also of major significance in the history of international Trotskyism because it was marked by the last great controversy in which Trotsky was involved, he being a leading protagonist of one side in the conflict. Background of the 1939 to 40 split. From the establishment of the Communist League of America in 1928, Cannon had been the national secretary of the U.S. Trotskyist movement. Virtually from the beginning, there had been unhappiness among other leaders about the way Cannon conducted the organization's business, and as early as 1929, an anti-Cannon faction was formed for the first time. No split evolved in the Trotskyist ranks at that time. However, in subsequent years, Cannon and Shachtman tended to attract different kinds of supporters and associates and to do different kinds of work in the organization. Cannon was a good organizer and worked particularly well with working class members and trade unionists that the Trotskyists were able to attract to their ranks. On the other hand, Cannon had little capacity for theoretical discussion or disputation. Shachtman, in contrast, was the intellectual leader of the Trotskyist ranks until 1940. Shachtman was an expert at Marxist-Leninist Trotskyist theorizing and exegesis, a major asset in leadership of a radical organization in that period. Shachtman was a witty orator with particular capacity to ridicule his or his organization's opponents. However, he also had the tendency to be long-winded. George Novak has recited a, quote, witticism, end quote, which he says was prevalent in the 1930s. Quote, Stalin expects to create socialism in one country, the Austro-Marxist in one city, Vienna, and Shachtman in one speech, end quote. He tended to gather the party's intellectuals, particularly after the merger with the Mustites and the, quote, raid, end quote, on the Socialist Party. Trotsky had regard for both men, but for different reasons. Trotsky obviously respected Shachtman's ability as a theorist and writer sufficiently to make him his literary executor. However, he clearly counted much more on the less imaginative and innovative Cannon to manage the organization of his American followers along the lines that he indicated were the correct ones. Cannon described the different roles which he and Shachtman had before the split. Quote, Shachtman and Burnham, did practically all the literary work. There was a division of labor between them and me, where I took care of the organization on trade union direction, administration, and finances, all the rest of the chores that intellectuals don't like to bother with, as a rule, and they did the writing, end quote. These differences were to play a significant role in the 1939 to 40 split. The Russian question. The basic controversy behind the split was the nature of the Soviet Union. Deriving from disagreements over the question were the immediate issues of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, and the relevance of that, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, posture to the party's attitude towards Soviet moves into Central Europe and Finland in late 1939. What by 1939 had become the, quote, traditional or, quote, orthodox position of the Trotskyists was that of Trotsky himself. Trotsky had argued first that the rise of Stalin to power had represented a, quote, Thermidorian reaction, end quote, with the Russian Revolution, the triumph of those opposed to further advances. Then he had come around to admitting that a, quote, caste, end quote, of bureaucrats had seized power in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and that it was therefore necessary to have a, quote, political revolution, end quote, against the Stalinist regime. At the same time, Trotsky argued that, quote, that the, quote, social relations, end quote, of the Soviet regime remained sound. In Problems of Development of the USSR, Trotsky wrote that, quote, the character of the social regime is determined first of all by the property relations, the nationalization of land, of the means of industrial production and exchange, with the monopoly of foreign trade in the hands of the state, constitute the basis of the social order in the USSR, ... By these property relations, lying at the basis of the class relations, is determined for us the nature of the Soviet Union as a proletarian state, end quote. Although this had been written in 1931, Trotsky had not fundamentally altered his position 8 years later. The Soviet Union remained a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, for Trotsky. Trotsky was absolutely unwilling to concede that the, quote, bureaucratic caste, end quote, constituted a new ruling class in the Marxist sense of that phrase. Disagreement with Trotsky's position was apparently first expressed within the United States Trotskyist ranks as early as 1937 by Joseph Friedman, who is better known by his party name Joseph Carter than one of the important but less publicized leaders of the Socialist Workers Party. There's a piece called Bureaucratic Collectivism by Joseph Carter that's on the YouTube channel. You should watch it because it has listen to it because it has very few views, but to my memory, it was a very insightful essay, very clear and to the point. Carter is described by Emanuel Geltman and Albert Glotzer as a person who could not make a public speech or write an article, even getting physically ill when he tried to do so, but who was a thinker and theorizer who was persuasive in personal conversation. He had considerable influence in some of the other Trotskyist leaders. Carter apparently first won over James Burnham and Emanuel Geltman to his point of view. Together, these three raised the issue officially within the party. They posed the question that if the USSR was no longer a workers' state and was certainly not a capitalist one, it had to be something else, and they asked what that something else was. The idea that there had arisen in the Soviet Union a new ruling class was not an entirely novel one at that time. An Italian ex-communist and ex-Trotskyist who went under the name of Bruno Rizzi, had put forth this notion in a pamphlet which was circulating at about this time. Emanuel Geltman insists that although the Socialist Workers Party leaders were aware of the existence of this pamphlet, none of the three who first raised the issue in the party had read it, and he is sure that Joseph Carter did not get the idea from the Bruno R. document. However, he has suggested that perhaps Carter had gotten the kernel for the idea from one of the writings of Rudolf Hilferding. Carter and his associates adopted the name, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, for the Soviet regime as it had evolved under Stalin, and insisted that it was neither capitalism nor the socialism foreseen by Marx and even by Lenin. During the founding conference of the Fourth International, to which both Shachtman and Geltman were delegates, Geltman tried to convince Shachtman of the validity of the notion. Shachtman refused to be convinced at that time. In fact, he opposed the bureaucratic collectivist idea very strongly, as was his wont when he was against any idea or group. Indeed, according to Geltman, the vehemence of Shachtman's opposition was strongest just before he was finally convinced of the validity of the bureaucratic collectivism argument. 30 years later, Shachtman told the author what line of thought brought him finally to side with Carter, Burnham, and Geltman on the issue of bureaucratic collectivism. In considering the Trotskyist position of, quote, unconditional support, end quote, of the Soviet Union, the thought came to him that if Soviet expansionism were to encompass Mexico, the Stalinists would certainly kill Trotsky and all of his followers in that country. It then struck him also that if the United States should ever fall under Stalinist control, he too would be among the earliest people to be shot as a result of the Soviet policies to which he had been offering. Shit. 1 second. Let me repeat that sentence because I had a thing pop up on my computer screen. In considering the Trotskyist position of, quote, unconditional support, end quote, of the Soviet Union, the thought came to Shachtman that if Soviet expansionism were to encompass Mexico, the Stalinists would certainly kill Trotsky and all of his followers in that country. It then struck him also that if the United States would ever fall under Stalinist control, he would be among the earliest people to be shot as a result of the Soviet policies to which he had been offering, quote, unconditional support, end quote. This idea brought him up short and began to make him question not only the, quote, unconditional support, end quote, position, but the nature of the Soviet regime itself and the absurdity of Trotskyist backing for a regime which, wherever its influence expanded, would have the murder of Trotskyists as one of its first orders of business. Shachtman probably wouldn't have too much knowledge of this, but that is precisely what happened everywhere that Trotskyists existed and Stalinists had some kind of significant political influence. The main ones you can think of would be China and Vietnam, but also Greece. It's something that a lot of people really don't think about too much when discussing such regimes, is their history of what their relationship was to dissidents to the left of them, even of the Leninist variety, much less the usually more impotent but more radical left communist or libertarian communist actors. The beginnings of the schism. However, by the time the split in the Socialist Workers' Party began to develop, the principal leaders of the group, which was ultimately to break with the party, were convinced that the Soviet Union could no longer be considered a, quote, worker state, end quote, degenerate or otherwise, but this was not the ostensible issue over which the factional battle took place. Rather, it was whether the Socialist Workers' Party should continue to follow Trotsky in pledging, quote, unconditional support, end quote, to the USSR in any and all conflicts with foreign powers. Ernest Erber sketched the issues which were openly debated in the 1939-40 struggle. Erber wrote that, quote, the minority took the position that Russia was engaging in an imperialist war which the bureaucracy had entered on behalf of its, quote, prestige, power, and revenues, end quote, and that revolutionists could not be defensists in such a war, ... Though an increasing number of minority supporters felt less sure about the validity of the, quote, worker state, end quote, designation, or openly stated that they no longer adhered to it, as did Comrade Johnson, the faction as a whole chose to lay aside the theoretical question temporarily and make the issue of the question of, quote, defensism or, quote, defeatism in relation to Russia's participation in the war in Poland and Finland. This view was shared by Burnham and Carter, who decided to refrain from raising their views on the class nature of Russia and join in a bloc with the minority on the political question, end quote. The struggle between the two factions began even before the outbreak of World War II. At the Socialist Workers' Party July 1939 convention, clashes occurred on both theoretical and organizational issues. Constance Ashton Myers has noted that, quote, Shachtman and C.L.R. James addressed international matters, the political question of the party's position on Stalin's demand for the right to, quote, guarantee, end quote, Poland and the Baltic states against German attack. They also wanted the party to take a stand on any possible pacts, predicted by Trotsky, between Hitler and Stalin and on the war, end quote. Myers added, quote, the delegates did not tackle those thorny problems, end quote. The disagreements in the realm of ideas led to factionalism when it came time to elect a new leadership. One of the minority faction documents issued during the ensuing fight noted that, quote, at the July 1939 convention, 2 lists were presented, Shachtman's for one group of comrades and Dunes for the Cannon faction, end quote. The minority claims somewhat disingenuously for the Shachtman list that, quote, there being no important or visible political differences in the party, the slate did not aim at any faction majority. Dune's slate aimed first and foremost at a majority for the Cannon clique, ... end quote. After the signing of the Stalin-Nazi Pact and outbreak of World War II, the struggle within the Socialist Workers Party was intensified. At a meeting of the political committee after the Soviet invasion of Poland, 3 resolutions on the situation were offered. Mario Pedrosa, Lebrun, noted that, quote, the great majority of the party leadership found itself confronted with this unhappy alternative. Either condemn the invasion, abandoning the slogan of unconditional defense, or keep the slogan and approve of the invasion. On this very question, the great majority of the leading comrades could only display their vacillations between the 2 opposing positions, defensist or defeatist, end quote. One of the resolutions presented at this meeting was, quote, the really courageous resolution, end quote, of Albert Goldman, quote, asking the party to approve the invasion by Stalin, end quote. Pedrosa noted that, quote, it received only his own vote. If we do not count one abstention as timid approval, end quote. On the other hand, quote, the Burnham Resolution condemning the invasion of Poland by the Red Army as a participation in a war of imperialist conquest got only 3 votes, ... end quote. Finally, quote, the resolution receiving the majority of the votes prudently avoided answering the question. It was edited so cautiously that it did not even dare to speak of a, quote, invasion, end quote, preferring a long paraphrase such as, quote, the participation of Russia in the war in Poland, end quote, end quote. This meeting of the political committee was followed by an extended controversy over the party's attitude toward the Soviet Union's role in the war, which did not end until the split in the party in April 1940. During this struggle, the majority of the top leadership sided with Cannon and Trotsky, and in inter-party documents were usually referred to thereafter as the majority, while those associated with Max Shachtman, Aberrin, and Burnham were the minority. Many years later, Shachtman commented on the minority position, quote, our own point of view was far from being as strong or as consistent, at least in my opinion, as it later became. It was shot through with many inconsistencies and many weaknesses. We were thinking on the run, so to speak. ... We felt then, even with those weaknesses and deficiencies, as I feel now, that we were on the right track and Trotsky was on the wrong track, end quote, Shachtman. Each of the 3 opposition leaders had his own position on the nature of the Soviet Union, according to Shachtman. Burnham had been convinced for at least a year that the USSR was no longer a worker state. Aberrin felt that it was a degenerated worker state, quote, but that in this war it was following an imperialist policy and should not be defended, end quote. As for Shachtman, quote, I occupied the notorious, quote, doubtist, end quote, position when I was pressed to say, I would say very frankly, quote, I am in doubt. I am no longer as sure as I was before that it is a workers' state. I am not ready, however, to say that it is no longer a workers' state. It is some other kind of state. End quote. That does not speak too highly of the clarity that I had at the time of this important question, but it speaks very accurately about my state of mind on the question. End quote. The next open confrontation was at a plenum in October 1939. There the issue was debated, and Burnham proposed a referendum on the issue among members of the Socialist Workers Party. The Cannonite majority turned down this suggestion, and in doing so had Trotsky's support. The role of Trotsky in the struggle. The controversy leading to the 1940 split among the U.S. followers was Trotsky's last great struggle. Shachtman, Burnham, Aburn, and their followers were questioning some of the most important teachings of their master, and were directly challenging Trotsky's policy toward World War II. After some apparent hesitation, Trotsky threw himself energetically into the conflict in support of Cannon and those associated with him. In organizational terms, Cannon and his closest associates carried the battle against the dissidents. However, in terms of theory and ideology, it was Trotsky who bore the brunt of the struggle. Cannon was obviously anxious to have Trotsky intervene as much as possible. He wrote Joseph Hansen, who was then in Mexico with Trotsky, and Trotsky on November 4th, 1939, quote, I could very well be satisfied with an attitude of aloofness or of a very restrained and limited intervention on your part in an ordinary dispute. But it is becoming clear every day that we are concerned now with a fundamental struggle for the program and the general ideology of our movement, not simply for the victory of the Bolshevik doctrine on this or that point, but for the supremacy of the system and method of Bolshevik politics and organization, ... In view of the fact that under the conditions of the war, our discussion on the Russian question becomes in essence the discussion of the Fourth International. We think international participation in the drafting of the Russian resolution is decidedly in order, end quote. On December 14th, 1939, Cannon wrote Hansen that, quote, on the face of things, now we appear to be insured of a small minority at the convention. A few shifts or surprises could change the situation in the other direction, ... I am very glad indeed to hear that Crux is writing another article on the most fundamental aspects of the present dispute. Crux, says here, Crux was one of Trotsky's pseudonyms. A really positive intervention on his part, which will present things as they really are, is perhaps the only thing now that can save for the Fourth International those who are worth saving, end quote. Cannon. When Trotsky finally did decide to fully intervene, he came to bear the great brunt of the polemical struggle for the majority. According to Max Shachtman, quote, we would write our polemical articles, Burnham, myself, others defending our point of view against the majority leadership, Cannon, Goldman, and their friends. But we would never, or almost never, be answered by them. The answers always came from Trotsky. It wasn't that he was our outstanding opponent. He was our opponent, period. ... There's no question in my mind that Trotsky felt that this dispute was more vital, more serious for the future of the Trotskyist movement than any of the disputes that had gone before in the Trotskyist movement, and so he launched a veritable bombardment against us, a polemical bombardment, end quote. Shachtman. Shachtman added that Trotsky sent his polemic to all Socialist Workers' Party branches. Shachtman noted that, quote, it was not very flattering to the leadership of the American Trotskyist movement, end quote. Subsequently, Trotsky's interventions were brought together as a book, In Defense of Marxism. That volume, consisting of articles as well as letters to various participants in the controversy, became one of his most widely quoted works in later years. Cannon's contributions to the polemics were published as The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. That volume, which also contains both polemical articles and some of Cannon's letters to his supporters and to Trotsky, also was widely cited by the Cannonites. There's a book that's carries a lot of the Max Shachtman and other people from the who would become the third camp, Trotskyism, in 2 volumes by edited by the Alliance for Workers' Liberties. I don't know, guiding light, I suppose. Sean Macdonald. The books are titled "The Fate of the Russian Revolution," Volume 1 and Volume 2. Issues. Unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. Max Shachtman defined clearly the position of the minority on the, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, issue insofar as it applied to Soviet behavior during the first months of World War II in an open letter to Trotsky dated January 1st, 1940. He started this discussion by noting that, quote, we advocated and urged support of a war to defend the Soviet Union from imperialist attack. In that case, we did not insist upon democratic formalities or even democratic realities as a condition for our defense. We said, the minority continues to say it, that if the imperialists assail the Soviet Union with the aim of crushing the last conquests of the October Revolution and reducing Russia to a bunch of colonies, we will support the Soviet Union unconditionally, end quote. Shachtman adds, quote, that would be a progressive war even under Stalin's command, and despite Stalin's command, we would fight for a democratic all-Soviet Congress to take over the helm, but we would not demand it as a preliminary condition for our support, end quote. However, Shachtman argued these considerations were not relevant to the Soviet behavior at the onset of the war. Quote, we did not advocate the invasion of Poland or the Baltic countries or Finland. We did not consider such actions necessary for the defense of the Soviet Union, conceived in a revolutionary internationalist sense. On the contrary, we condemned the invasions. You even called the invasion of Poland, quote, criminal and shameful, end quote. To this day, I do not understand by what right of formal or dialectical logic we should, in the light of this, call upon the workers to give material and military support to the invasion, which has as its clear-cut objective that very annexation which we condemn and oppose, end quote. With regard to the specific case of the Finnish invasion, Shachtman commented, quote, according to the resolution on Finland of the Cannon faction, which you support, the Fourth International tells the Russian workers not only to be Soviet patriots in general, but to give material and military support to Stalin's army in Stalin's war. What attitude the Finnish proletariat should take towards the Red Army, our fearless, quote, unconditional defensists, end quote, do not indicate by a single syllable. On what conceivable basis can we advocate such a policy to the Russian working class? How can we defend it before the American working class or even its vanguard elements? End quote. Max Shachtman. Shachtman refuted the claims of the Cannon faction and Trotsky concerning the, quote, progressive, end quote, nature of the Soviet incursion into Finland. Shachtman commented, quote, I find even less for your, how shall I put it, astonishing remarks about Finland. You say that we do not, quote, mention by so much as a word that the Red Army in Finland appropriates large landowners and introduces workers' control while preparing for the expropriation of the capitalists, end quote. True. Not by so much as a word. Why? Because the first anyone who has heard in our party, anyone, of the expropriation of the large landowners and the introduction of workers' control in Finland by the Red Army is in your article. Where is this taking place? On what reports do you base yourself? There is no trace of workers' control in the Soviet Union today. There is even less than that in Finland. That, at least so far as my knowledge goes, and on this point I have questioned unavailingly many Cannonites, end quote. Shachtman went on to question Trotsky's claim that a, quote, civil war, end quote, had broken out in Finland. Quote, where is the civil war in Finland, which is, quote, evidently already beginning, end quote. Unless you refer to the government of the idiotic scoundrel Kuusinen, we have not yet seen the first traces of that civil war, regardless of how much we should like to see that civil war, no matter how anxious we are to develop a policy that will promote it, no matter how firmly we count upon its eventual materialization. Do you deduce this, quote, civil war, end quote, from an abstract and false theoretical estimation of the role of the Kremlin bureaucracy, or is there some objective evidence that this, quote, concrete process is taking place in Finland, end quote, end quote? Shachtman. Shachtman best summed up his group's position on the, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, issue as it applied to the first months of the war in the following passage. Quote, let me accept, then, your characterization of our traditional position. We have never defended, not even conditionally, Stalin's international policy. We give no unconditional support to the Kremlin's diplomatic and military activities. Our policy is not determined by the Kremlin's deeds and crimes. Good. ... Concretely, for example, we did not support the Kremlin's policy towards bourgeois Finland or Poland, etc. But what is war? War is the continuation of politics by other means. Then why should we support the war which is the continuation of the international policy which we did not and do not support? The Fourth International also told the Russian proletariat not to support the Kremlin's foreign policy. Then why should we now tell the Soviet workers to support a war which is the continuation of that policy? End quote, Max Shachtman. The, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, issue. Trotsky and the Cannonites insisted that the split within the Socialist Workers' Party was along class lines, that the, quote, genuine proletarians, end quote, were with Cannon and the majority, and that the minority was led by and consisted of, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, elements in the party. The minority in the political committee issued a detailed reply to this charge early in March 1940. They sought to rebut the, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, charge on both a factual and theoretical basis. On the question of fact, whether most workers in the party supported the majority, the minority statement commented that, quote, the triumphant reference of the Cannonites to the fact that the Minneapolis branch, for example, supports the majority, with such remarkable unanimity, too, does not decide for a minute the correctness or incorrectness of their political position. There is no smaller number of proletarian militants in other sections of the party who support the standpoint of the minority, end quote. In response to Trotsky's claim that the minority had assumed a, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, position ever since the establishment of the Socialist Workers' Party, the political committee minority, after discussing the specific issues cited by Trotsky to prove this point, commented that, quote, what it was necessary to prove was that the minority, on a series of political questions in the past, took or tended to take a petty bourgeois position on those questions as against the Cannonites, who took or tended to take the Marxist position. Even if Trotsky is granted all his points, they would at best show that on the whole the position of both the majority and the minority was the same in the 11 cases he mentions. The distinction between the two groups first occurs clearly on the Russian question. It is therefore necessary to demonstrate how, on this question, the position of the minority is petty bourgeois. But this is no easy matter. At least it has not yet been done, and in our opinion it cannot be done, end quote, Shachtman. Trotsky is probably correct in arguing that most of the working class elements in the Socialist Workers' Party supported him and Cannon. However, what was clearly true was that the overwhelming majority of the members of the Young People's Socialist League, Fourth International, sided with the minority. Many years later, Ernest Erber, who had been chairman of the YPSL, the Young People's Socialist League, Fourth International, when it was the youth group of the Socialist Party, and continued to hold that post in the youth group of the Socialist Workers' Party, noted that the young people were repelled by what they saw as the extreme dogmatism of the Cannonites. He concluded that the youth leaders didn't have a, quote, Bolshevik mentality, end quote. Trotsky and Burnham. Trotsky centered a considerable amount of his rhetoric in this dispute on James Burnham. Trotsky made much of the fact that Burnham was a professor and attacked him especially because Burnham did not believe in the dialectic and dialectical materialism in particular. Trotsky argued that Burnham's occupation and his, quote, fundamental, end quote, disagreements with Marxism made Burnham a, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, and explained the, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, position which he had taken on the nature of the Soviet Union and the question of, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of the USSR. Trotsky sent a 22-page, quote, open letter to James Burnham, end quote, which dealt particularly with Burnham's open rejection of dialectical materialism as a necessary basis for revolutionary politics. Trotsky cited at considerable length the adherence of, quote, true, end quote, revolutionary leaders to Marxist dialectical materialism and associated the shortcomings of such people as Edward Bernstein and Karl Kautsky with their rejection of or lack of concern with that philosophy. He then attributes the, quote, errors, end quote, of the Socialist Workers' Party opposition on the question of unconditional support to the USSR to their lack of belief in dialectical materialism. Trotsky concluded that the coming Socialist Workers' Party convention, quote, in my opinion, must declare categorically that in their attempts to divorce sociology from dialectical materialism and politics from sociology, the leaders of the opposition have broken from Marxism and become the transmitting mechanism for petty bourgeois empiricism, ... end quote, Trotsky. Burnham wrote a long reply to Trotsky which he entitled Science and Style, and in which he excoriated Trotsky. He accused Trotsky of dragging in the issue of dialectical materialism as a, quote, red herring, end quote. He then commented that quote, I can understand and even sympathize with your recourse to dialectics in the current dispute. There is little else for you to write about, with every appeal you make to actual events refuted the day after you make it, end quote. In defense of his own philosophical position, Burnham started by saying that, quote, I regard you as one of the most competent historians and political scientists in the world, ... but your qualifications in these fields do not automatically assure your competence also in the fields of philosophy, logic, natural science, and scientific method, end quote. Burnham added that most of what Engels said, quote, in these latter fields, end quote, he found, quote, confused or outmoded by subsequent scientific investigation, end quote, and that, quote, you, ... serve up to us only a stale rehash of Engels, ... In all the elaborated confusion of your new remarks on dialectics, you make only one attempt at an argument in favor of dialectics, and this argument, upon examination, turns out to be both irrelevant and reactionary, end quote. James Burnham. Trotsky's argument is that, quote, all the great and outstanding revolutionists stood on the ground of dialectical materialism, end quote. But Burnham asked, quote, is this weapon not identical in form with the weapon in extremis of all reaction? Do you dare to disbelieve when our fathers believed, and their fathers and forefathers before them, end quote? Burnham argued that belief in dialectical materialism was not, quote, fundamental, end quote, to the struggle then going on in the Socialist Workers' Party. Burnham maintained that, quote, there are no fundamental questions, quote, in general, end quote, ... Within each systematized field of knowledge, there are certain principles which can be regarded from the point of view of that field as fundamental. The only fundamentals relevant to our present dispute are the fundamentals of politics. Presumably, we are not band together as a society of mathematicians or a school of art, end quote. He added, quote, the fundamentals of politics are constituted by the central aim, together with the most important means which are regarded as necessary in achieving that aim, end quote. James Burnham. Burnham accused Trotsky of having, quote, absorbed too much of Hegel, of his monolithic, his totalitarian vision of a block universe in which every part is related to every other part, in which everything is relevant to everything else, where the destruction of a single grain of dust means the annihilation of the whole, end quote. Later, Burnham repeated this thought, saying that, quote, again you proceed from a totalitarian conception which relates everything to everything with iron bonds, end quote. This is a side note. If you read Michael Heinrich's Introduction to Marx, he has a brief section about dialectics, which I really like. And he says, if you, he recommends avoiding when you're trying to understand the critique of political economy, references to the term dialectics, because usually when someone says, oh, we have to look at this X, Y, and Z dialectically, what they're basically saying is that everything is connected or related to or causally relevant to everything else. And Heinrich says something to the effect of like, yeah, in most cases that's true, but that's just general assertion that everything is related to everything else doesn't really tell you anything about the nature of those relationships. Especially when you're speaking of like very specific entities. Anyway. Back to the text. As to the specific political issue under discussion, Burnham held that, quote, Trotsky can propose the strategy of defense of the Stalinist bureaucracy as the lesser evil. It doesn't make any difference what Trotsky can't say about their policies. This is what it comes down to in practice. ... The opposition ... proposes the strategy of the third camp, end quote. Burnham added that, quote, this conflict of strategical orientation is the central political issue and nothing else, end quote. In reading this this book by Robert J Alexander on international Trotskyism, this is the first time I'm reading the words third camp. So I was supposing that the third camp, so it's kind of giving me the impression that the concept of third camp at least strongly has something to do with Burnham's contribution from the Shachtmanite minority. So that's interesting. Burnham accused Trotsky of undermining his whole movement. He said, quote, Comrade Trotsky, in the course of your intervention in the present dispute, you have struck such heavy blows against the Fourth International that for my own part I am not convinced that the International will be able to survive them, ... The truth can only destroy a false doctrine, and therefore you are compelled to evade the truth and to hide it, end quote. Finally, Burnham attacked some of the innuendos used by Trotsky. He commented that, quote, you sin more grievously than you even understand, Comrade Trotsky. In a cheap manner, you twice grimace at Shachtman for trying to, quote, conduct the revolution, end quote, from, quote, the Bronx, end quote. Not merely are you appealing to a usual reactionary provincialism directed against the metropolis. Do you know what further meaning, quote, the Bronx, end quote, has in this country, Comrade Trotsky? Do you know that to nearly every American it means not only a New Yorker, but a Jew? And are you so naive as to think that our party, yes, even our party, is altogether immune to influence from such an association? The weapons you are now using have a fearful habit of backfiring, end quote. It is doubtful that Leon Trotsky was ever attacked more vigorously or more bitingly by anyone within his own ranks than by Burnham in this document. 1 second. Okay, the issue of a split. Although Trotsky and Cannon were united in their opposition to the positions of the minority, there seems to have been some disagreement between them concerning the inevitability or desirability of a split in the Socialist Workers' Party as a result of the controversy. As late as February 20th, 1940, Trotsky wrote to the International Executive Committee of the Fourth International that, quote, in view of the exceptional situation created by the sharp fight and profound divergencies, the future minority can ask for certain reasonable guarantees in order to prevent a premature and not unavoidable split, end quote. 2 months earlier, Trotsky had invited Shachtman to come to Mexico to discuss the issue in dispute, apparently with the hope that some meetings of minds might be possible. However, Shachtman turned down the invitation. Cannon did not share Trotsky's desire to maintain party unity. According to the minority, quote, long before the Cleveland Conference of the Opposition, Cannon, in the presence of Louis Lebrun of the IEC and Shachtman, I think the IEC is International Executive Committee, I'm not sure, and Shachtman proposed to the last named a, quote, cold split, end quote, with a division of the, quote, property, end quote. When this was reported to the membership meeting in New York also months ago and at the last city convention, Cannon did not even attempt to deny the truth of the report. Indeed, in his reply, he implicitly confirmed it, end quote. On March 8th, more than a month before the Socialist Workers' Party convention, Cannon sent a circular letter to, quote, all majority groups, end quote, in which he wrote, quote, in the meantime, the most important thing is to make all necessary organizational preparations for the inevitable split. See that all membership lists of sympathizers, contacts, and so forth are in safe hands. Have all supporters of the majority prepared for resolute action the moment the split becomes a formal reality. It is important to impress upon any comrades playing with the idea of a split that it can only mean the beginning of a merciless war with us. Some of them undoubtedly are playing with the idea that they can split the party and still maintain some kind of friendly and comradely relations with us. It must be made clear to them that friendship ceases when the party is attacked, end quote. Cannon. Cannon and his colleagues in the national headquarters took steps to carry out his own instructions. Many years later, Stanley Plastrick remembered that some weeks before the April convention, he, as manager of the party's newspaper, was shocked one day when he went to cash a check for the paper at the bank and was told that the money in that account had been changed to another account without his being notified. Plastrick told Shachtman about this, and they agreed this meant that Cannon was taking all of the party's funds into the hands of his faction and that this meant he was going to force a split in the party. Meanwhile, Cannon carried on a violent polemic against the opposition. Although Trotsky, as we have seen, made certain personal attacks on the opposition leaders, Cannon was even more strident in this regard. Cannon was particularly strong in his onslaught against Martin Aburn, who, together with Shachtman and Burnham, was one of the three principal opposition leaders. Among other attacks on Aburn was a document, quote, Aburnism, the case history of a disease, end quote. In it, Cannon claimed that, quote, the Aburn group is a permanent family clique whose uninterrupted existence and perfidic practices are known to all the older members of the party. For more than 10 years, it has waged a now open, now concealed, but never interrupted factional struggle against the party leadership, end quote. He stated that, quote, Abernism is abhorred by the basic cadres of the party, end quote, and that, quote, since the very beginning of the present factional struggle, Shachtman and Burnham have suffered from the most embarrassing contradiction as a result of their combination with Abern, end quote. Where am I? The factional struggle. The struggle for control of the Socialist Workers' Party was waged over many months. Constance Ashton Myers has described the process, quote, vigorous campaigning was begun. Cannon boasted that in February alone he had made 43 speeches and a total of 60 by April. He debated Shachtman again and again in meetings, By February 20th, the mimeograph machine had churned out 11 special internal bulletins and would print 4 more by April 5th, the opening debate of the convention, end quote. The conflict spread. Myers has noted that, quote, to win the California locals, the National Committee launched Murray Weiss on a Western tour. CLR James left New York for Los Angeles without official authorization to present the minority viewpoint to the Western comrades. Shachtman toured the Midwest, all the while heated letters to branches poured from Cannon's pen, end quote. Cannon, writing after the April 1940 convention, described the factional fight in glowing terms, quote, the decision of the party came at the end of a thoroughgoing Democratic Party discussion which left not a single question unclarified. The discussion was formally opened early in October and continued uninterruptedly for 6 months. It is highly doubtful that any party discussion anywhere was ever so extensive, so complete and so democratically conducted as this one. 13 big international bulletins were published by the National Committee during the discussion, with the space about equally divided between the factions, and there was an unrestricted distribution of factional documents besides those published in the official bulletins. In addition, there were innumerable debates and speeches in party membership meetings. Such an extensive and drawn-out discussion may appear to be abnormal, even for a democratic organization such as ours, which settles all disputed questions by free and democratic discussion. So it was, end quote. Cannon. The 1940 Convention. The controversy came to a climax at the April 1940 convention. Subsequently, both sides agreed that the split among the delegates was approximately 60% for the Cannon group and 40% for the opposition. They disagreed about the significance of the division, the Cannonites stressing the, quote, proletarian, end quote, background of their delegates, the opposition claiming that since they also had 70% of the YPSL, they represented, quote, a majority of the Fourth International Movement in the United States, end quote. 3 major subjects were on the agenda. 1, a discussion of the trade union activities of the party was, quote, non-controversial, end quote, in terms of its subject matter, but had factional overtones. Subsequently, Cannon argued that, quote, the opposition, was greatly compromised and discredited by the fact that it virtually abstained from participation in this extensive discussion. They had nothing to say and nothing to report, end quote. The dissidents, on the other hand, claimed that this trade union subject, quote, was transformed into a lengthy filibuster lasting 1 whole day. This was intended to impress the minority that it was, quote, breaking with the proletarian section of the party, This, quote, demonstration, end quote, against the minority fell of its own weight, end quote. The 2 subjects of bitter debate were those over the role of the USSR in World War II and over organizational questions. The majority won decisively on both of these, with a substantial minority opposing them. The minority presented a proposed resolution, quote, "The Second World War and the Soviet Union," end quote, which proclaimed the war to be, quote, "a new struggle among the great powers for a redivision of the earth," end quote. The minority argued that from this, quote, "there follows the strategy which revolutionary socialists are obligated to adopt with respect to it, the strategy of the third camp," end quote. This draft resolution proclaimed that, quote, "the Soviet Union is participating integrally in the world imperialist war for the redivision of the earth, The reactionary character of its participation is demonstrated equally by the policy and aims of the Soviet government and army, bureaucratic expansionism, which in no way advance or defend the interests of the Russian or the world proletariat, end quote. It followed, therefore, that, quote, "revolutionary socialists are obligated, to revise the former conception of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union," end quote, end quote. This minority resolution seemed not to have been debated. The organizational question centered on the minority's insistence in a, quote, "resolution on party unity," end quote, that, quote, "the party must extend to whichever group is the minority at the convention the right to publish a public political journal of its own, defending the general program of the Fourth International, and at the same time presenting in an objective manner the special position of its tendency on the disputed Russian question," end quote. The Cannonites rejected this, passing a resolution which repudiated, quote, "the attempt of the petty bourgeois minority to impose its will," end quote, on the issue, and threatened expulsion of anyone who should try to publish such a journal. They also passed a resolution offering the minority representation on party committees and publications, but declared the discussion, quote, "closed," end quote. It was these resolutions on organizational matters which made a split in the party inevitable. They assured that the minority could no longer continue publicly to advocate their points of view within the party, leaving them with the choice of giving up their positions on the issues involved, which they had no intention of doing, or advocating them from outside the Socialist Workers' Party. The Workers' Party. The formation of the Workers' Party. The minority did not immediately withdraw from the Socialist Workers' Party, rather they waited to be thrown out. Action against them was not long in coming. At the political committee meeting on April 16th, less than 10 days after the convention, the minority members of the committee were, quote, "suspended," end quote, for membership. They and their followers were given until September to announce their full acceptance of the decisions of the April convention, after which, if they had not done so, they would be considered separated from the Socialist Workers' Party. At a subsequent plenum, the oppositionists were formally expelled from the party. The dissidents soon established their own organization, the Workers' Party. They began publishing a weekly newspaper, Labor Action, which proclaimed on its banner that the new party was an affiliate of the Fourth International, although the Fourth International never gave it such a standing. The new Workers' Party carried out a minor coup against its former comrades. Shachtman and Burnham had both been among the editors of New International, the, quote, "theoretical," end quote, organ of the Socialist Workers' Party. They proceeded to bring out a new issue of New International, but now as the theoretical organ of the Workers' Party. Rather than seeking a legal remedy against the dissidents, the Socialist Workers' Party began to issue a new periodical, Fourth International, the first issue of which came out in May 1940. Constance Ashton Myers said that in this division, quote, "the Socialist Workers' Party split, quote, right down the middle, 50-50, end quote, the former minority faction having 40% of the membership, including prominent intellectuals, and 80% of the Young People's Socialist League," end quote. She said that the Socialist Workers Party before the split had a membership of around 800 to 1,000. The new party thus began with a membership which was probably something less than 500. In such divisions, there is always a certain proportion of members who drop out entirely, not affiliating with either group. Early Workers' Party defections. Within a few months of the Workers' Party lost two of its most distinguished intellectual figures, Burnham and Dwight Macdonald. It was to lose a significant group of others some years later. James Burnham had been one of the three leading figures in the Socialist Workers' Party minority and a founding member of the Workers' Party. However, his possible abandonment of Trotskyism was perhaps presaged in his polemic exchange with Trotsky when he expressed his doubts as to whether the Fourth International could ever, quote, recover, end quote, from the blows which he conceived Trotsky as having dealt in the process of the Socialist Workers' Party factional fight. Burnham had in any case a somewhat peculiar position in the Trotskyist leadership. Shachtman later described Burnham as belonging to the, quote, bourgeois aristocracy, end quote, and as being, quote, very scholarly in knowledge, end quote. Shachtman noted that Burnham had learned but did not use Trotskyist jargon and had learned Trotsky's ideas rapidly after joining the movement with the American Workers' Party. Burnham sought to orient the Socialist Workers' Party towards, quote, American political questions, end quote. Shachtman concluded that, quote, all of us, felt that although he was with us and with us thoroughly, he wasn't, so to say, of us, end quote. Within a few weeks of the split, Burnham abandoned the Trotskyist ranks completely, resigning from the Workers' Party. A year or so later, he published what is probably his best-known book, The Managerial Revolution, which, although not abandoning Marxist reasoning completely, was certainly too heretical even for the Workers' Party. It argued that a new ruling class had not only evolved in the Soviet Union as he had maintained in the Socialist Workers' Party internal fight, but that new ruling classes had emerged in Nazi Germany and in the United States. Even more heterodox was his argument that in all three cases the new ruling group was the same, the, quote, managerial class, end quote, which was thrust into its position by the size and complexity of modern industrial societies, which put those with, quote, managerial, end quote, skills in a position to dominate those societies and economies. Subsequently, Burnham moved even further from Trotskyism. He became one of the leading lights of the National Review, the most important right-wing, quote, journal of opinion, end quote, in the United States, founded by William Buckley in the 1950s. Burnham also became a witness in favor of the government in the suit of his former colleagues of the Workers' Party to get off the infamous Attorney General's list. With the departure of Burnham, the Workers' Party people came to be known almost universally as the, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote. Dwight Macdonald abandoned the Workers' Party only a few months after Burnham. The beginning of Macdonald's movement out of the party came when the editors of New International at first refused to publish a 30,000-word article about Nazism, in which Macdonald argued that Nazi Germany was also characterized, like the Soviet Union, by, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. As Macdonald wrote many years later, quote, the editors were not enthusiastic. They were, frankly, rather disappointed in the article, which struck them as half-baked, superficial, trivial, boring, and badly written, end quote, but finally agreed to publish a 4,000-word summary of it. Macdonald commented that, quote, since everything else I had submitted since 1938 had been gladly printed, professional journalists don't grow on trees, not on Trotskyist trees. I concluded they might also have some objections to the heterodox nature of my thesis, end quote. Subsequently, Macdonald was removed from the editorial board of the New International, quote, for conduct unbecoming a Marxist, end quote, and articles by him in Partisan Review were sharply attacked by Shachtman and others. So on March 22, 1941, Macdonald wrote an 8,000-word letter which was a kind of ultimatum to the Workers' Party leadership. Macdonald asked for internal party discussion of issues he had raised and expressed hope, quote, of arresting the present rapid degeneration of the Workers' Party into the kind of undesirable bureaucratic conservative regime which we rejected last year in the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. Macdonald later wrote that, quote, the rectifications were not made, the degeneration was not arrested, and a few weeks later I resigned from the party, end quote. Dwight Macdonald. Bureaucratic, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, defined. Once they were out of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' Party people renewed among themselves discussion concerning the nature of the Soviet state and society. Shachtman took the lead, attempting to define the, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, which he, Burnham, and others had decided was the proper description of what existed in the USSR. The fundamental document which defined the position of the Shachtmanites on the nature of the Soviet Union was his essay dated December 30th, 1940. Although in this he used the phrase, quote, bureaucratic state socialism, end quote, rather than, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, Shachtman noted in his book, The Bureaucratic Revolution, in which this essay was republished, that, quote, to avoid even a verbal identification of the Stalinist regime with socialism, I subsequently dropped this term and used in its stead, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, Shachtman. This was the phrase used in the resolution adopted at the September 1941 convention of the Workers' Party, which first put the organization on record in support of the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, idea. Shachtman started his discussion with tribute to Trotsky's contributions to understanding the evolution of the USSR. He then summed up, quote, our traditional view of the character of the Soviet Union, end quote, in the following terms. Quote, to guarantee progress towards socialism, the existence of nationalized property is necessary but not sufficient. A revolutionary proletarian regime is needed in that country, plus favorable international conditions, victory of the proletariat in more advanced capitalist countries. To characterize the Soviet Union as a workers' state, the existence of nationalized property is necessary and sufficient. The Stalinist bureaucracy is a caste. To become a ruling class, the Stalinist bureaucracy must establish new property forms, end quote. Shachtman then argued that Trotsky's own document, The USSR in War, written after the outbreak of the war, quote, declared it theoretically possible, ... 1. For the property forms and relations now existing in the Soviet Union to continue existing and yet represent not a workers' state but a new exploiting society. And 2, for the bureaucracy now existing in the Soviet Union to become a new exploiting and ruling class without changing the property forms and relations it now rests upon, end quote. This was in fact what had happened, argued Shachtman. He said that under capitalism, the bourgeoisie was the ruling class because it owned the means of production and distribution through the instrumentality of private property, whereas the proletariat owned nothing except its labor power. Because of its control of the economy, the bourgeoisie dominated the state. In the case of the Soviet Union, the state had taken over the means of production and distribution under the Bolshevik regime. Thereafter, although the proletariat, quote, remains a propertyless class, end quote, its position has fundamentally changed. Quote, the essence of the change lies in the fact that the working class is in command of that state-owned property, because the state is the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Through its Soviets, its army, its courts, and institutions like the party, the unions, the factory, committees, etc., there is the hub of the question, end quote. However, with the Stalinist, quote, counter-revolution, end quote, Shachtman argued that there, quote, came the end of rule of the working class. The Soviets were eviscerated and finally wiped out formally by decree. The trade unions were converted into slave drivers cracking the whip over the working class. Workers' control in the factories went a dozen years ago. The people were forbidden to bear arms, even non-explosive weapons. ... The militia system gave way decisively to the army separated from the people. ... The Communist Party was gutted and the Bolsheviks in it broken into, imprisoned, exiled, and finally shot, end quote. It was the bureaucracy which had displaced the proletariat, according to Shachtman. He argued that, quote, the bureaucracy is no longer the controlled and revocable, quote, managers and superintendents, end quote, employed by the workers' state in the party, the state apparatus, the industries, the army, the unions, the fields, but the owners and controllers of the state, which is in turn the repository of collectivized property and thereby the employer of all hired hands, the masses of the workers above all included, end quote. Shachtman summed up this process saying, quote, "The workers of the Soviet Union were unable to hold power, that they lost it in a peculiar, unforeseen, and even unforeseeable way, not because of a bourgeois restoration, but in the form of the seizure of power by a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy which retained and based itself on the new collectivist form of property, is true, but they did lose power, ... end quote." The continued struggle over bureaucratic collectivism. Although the Shachtman position on the nature of the Soviet Union was adopted, quote, by a narrow margin, end quote, at the Workers' Party 1941 convention, the issue continued to be debated within the party. At that convention, C.L.R. James presented a resolution describing the Soviet Union as, quote, state capitalist, end quote. C.L.R. James was an important member of the Shachtmanite group. A native of Trinidad, he had been a leading figure in the British Trotskyist movement in its early years. Upon arriving in the United States in 1938, James had been toured around the country by the Socialist Workers Party, in part in an attempt to recruit blacks to the organization at a time when they amounted to only a handful. As an official representative of the British Trotskyists on the International Executive Committee of the Fourth International, he was one of the two non-Americans there to side with the Shachtmanites. Within the Workers' Party, James regularly edited a column in Labor Action on, quote, the Negroes' fight, end quote. James edited a special issue of New International after the fall of France, setting forth the Workers' Party's opposition to the war. He also established contact for the Workers' Party with the sharecroppers movement then active in Missouri. In the Workers' Party controversy over the nature of the Soviet Union, James argued that essentially the role of the Soviet bureaucracy was not qualitatively different from that of the bourgeoisie in the capitalist countries. He said that, quote, "Today the bureaucracy, ... plans in order to get as much surplus value as possible from the workers. It plans to preserve itself against other capitalist classes. An individual capitalist who is unable to extract surplus value goes bankrupt, gets a government subsidy, or allows his capital to lie fallow. The state as national capitalist produced in certain branches at a loss, which is atoned for by gain in others. Why is the total national capital any less capital? Because it exploits the workers under unified control instead of in separate conflicting parts," end quote. C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya and their followers, known by the two leaders' pseudonyms as the Johnson Forest Tendency, finally left the Workers' Party in 1947, and in spite of the position they had maintained on the Russian question, rejoined the Socialist Workers' Party. By the early 1950s, James had quit the Socialist Workers' Party again and for a while maintained his own small faction. The issue raised by James within the Workers' Party, although appearing esoteric to an outsider, was of considerable consequence in terms of Marxist theory and politics. If the Soviet Union was characterized by state capitalism, that meant it was just a new version of the capitalism about which Marx, Engels, Lenin, and others had written. However, Shachtman was right, and the Soviet Union was a, quote, bureaucratic, collectivist, end quote, economy and society. That meant that it was something new, and that Marx's prediction that capitalism could be succeeded only by socialism was wrong, that there was a possibility of something quite different developing. International contacts of the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party continued to claim that it was part of the Fourth International. Although it was not able to make this claim effective, there was certain support for the position of the Shachtmanites within the leadership of the Fourth International. In December 1940, Labor Action published a declaration signed by 4 members of the Bureau of the International, identified as Brown, Anthony, Alberts, and Trent. It said that, quote, The split in the American section of the International has had direct immediate repercussions in the International as a whole and in its central institutions in particular, end quote. The declaration announced the, quote, emergency international conference, end quote, of the Fourth International, which had been held on the initiative of the Socialist Workers Party after the Socialist Workers Party split. The declaration went on to say that, quote, the undersigned comrades represent the majority of the International Bureau of the Fourth International, ... These comrades supported, as is known, the viewpoint of the minority of the Socialist Workers' Party, now organized as the Workers' Party. This viewpoint has also been endorsed by the Brazilian section of the International, the Uruguayan section, and by two important sections in Asia which have recently come over to the program of the Fourth International, and by groups of comrades and individuals in other sections throughout the world, end quote. Emanuel Geltman, as the first international secretary of the Workers' Party, had extensive correspondence with leaders of Trotskyist groups in various countries. One of these was the dissident leader of the Dutch Trotskyist, Snevliet, with whom he had a considerable exchange of letters. Another group which had some sympathy for the Shachtmanites' position consisted of some of the leaders of the Belgian Trotskyists. In spite of the claims of support from outside of the United States, no Shachtmanite faction of the Fourth International was organized at that time. At the first full-fledged post-war Congress of the Fourth International in Paris in 1948, the Workers' Party was recognized as a, quote, sympathetic organization, end quote, which could be represented by delegates having, quote, consultative rights, end quote, which meant that they could speak on the floor and could vote, but their vote would not be counted. Shachtman represented the Workers' Party at that Congress. It was the last time the Shachtmanites were able to participate in the proceedings of the Fourth International. The Workers' Party during World War II. Throughout World War II, the Workers' Party maintained its, quote, third camp, end quote, position. This meant that it continued on a political level at least, to oppose support of either side in the war, even after the attack of the Nazis on the Soviet Union and entry of the United States into the conflict. This contrasted with the position of the Socialist Workers' Party, which in pursuance of its, quote, defensist, end quote, doctrine had to support participation of the Soviet Union and thus, quote, objectively, end quote, the Allied side in the conflict after June 1941. Ironically, the avowedly anti-war Workers' Party suffered less at the hands of U.S. authorities during the war than did the pro-Soviet Socialist Workers' Party. There were no Smith Act prosecutions against the Shachtmanites such as those against the Socialist Workers' Party. However, as we will discuss, there were particular political reasons for the legal actions taken against the official U.S. Trotskyites. Although the Workers' Party did not politically support the war, it did not call on its members to refuse military service or to try to sabotage the war effort. The Workers' Party members and leaders were as much affected by the draft and other results of the war as anyone else. Military conscription in particular had an impact on the functioning of the party. Irving Howe, editor of Labor Action, was drafted. Then his successor, Emanuel Geltman, was also called. At that point, Shachtman came up with what he thought was an ingenious way to prevent Geltman from being mobilized, for him to inform the military authorities fully of his, quote, revolutionary, end quote, activities, on the supposition that the armed forces would not want such a, quote, subversive, end quote, in their midst. This plot did not work. Geltman was not only drafted, but was soon with the U.S. Army stationed in Great Britain. Workers' Party leaders and members who remained civilians worked during the war not only to keep the party active, but to extend its influence. They particularly tried to gain support in the labor movement. Among the areas in which the party did trade union work was the shipyard workers in the Camden, New Jersey area. They also helped organize opposition to the CIO's shipbuilding workers' union leaders John Green and Philip Van Gelder, former socialists who were then allied with the communists. The Workers' Party members there fought against efforts of Green and Vangelder to downplay any labor protests on the grounds that these would interfere with the need to turn out ships required in the war and that production should not be disrupted. However, the Shachtmanites had little success in trying to oust the Green-Vangelder leadership. The quote dissent end quote split. A few years after the war, the Shachtmanites underwent a split which, although it did not bring into existence any new radical party, resulted in establishment of a periodical which became a significant influence on the U.S. left for many years. This was the breakaway which gave rise to dissent. The dissident group consisted principally of Emanuel Geltman, Sidney Plastrick, and Irving Howe. Irving Howe subsequently remembered that he began to have doubts about the Workers' Party position after getting out of the armed forces and returning to party work as editor of Labor Action. Irving Howe's first question was whether the party had been right in opposing the Allies' cause in the war. However, such retroactive reevaluation was not what began to cause serious discrepancies within the Shachtmanite ranks. The Marshall Plan generated the first controversies which were to result in the split away of the dissent group. Shachtman and the majority of the leadership were strongly opposed to any support of the Marshall Plan. Geltman, however, took the lead in the political committee in arguing that the Workers' Party ought to support the plan. Geltman and his allies in the party leadership argued that for there to be a labor and socialist movement, there had to be an economy which could employ the workers, and the Marshall Plan was an effort to reestablish such an economy in Europe. In addition, the only way to stop Soviet expansionism, to which the Workers' Party was opposed, was to reconstruct the European economy. Shachtman would not accept such arguments. On the contrary, he saw support of the Marshall Plan as support of, quote, American imperialism, end quote, and Shachtman at one point announced dramatically that he would support American imperialism only when hair grew on the palm of his hands. Years later, when Shachtman was supporting the United States in the Vietnam War, Geltman asked on several occasions to see the hair growing on Shachtman's palms. Shachtman continued to have the support of a majority of the party leaders for his position. During the 1948 election, the party opposed both Truman and Dewey. Geltman, as editor of Labor Action, wrote numerous articles and editorials about the supposed Tweedledee and Tweedledum nature of that campaign. Some months later, he reached the conclusion that the Shachtmanites had been wrong in their position, and he raised this question in a meeting of the political committee early in 1950 and suggested a discussion of the issue. Years later, Geltman, whose, quote, party name, end quote, was Manny Garrett, remembered that his suggestion had met with an exceedingly frigid reception. One member of the committee commented that, quote, what Garrett had said is beyond the pale, end quote, and the meeting went on as if Geltman had not spoken. Geltman finally turned to Stanley Plastrick, another committee member, and observed that it looked as if he and Plastrick were not present. Even organizational questions arose. Geltman and his friends concluded that it was silly to maintain all of the panoply of, quote, Bolshevik, end quote, of a, quote, Bolshevik, end quote, party with a political committee, a central committee, and other organs, when the total membership of the group could not fill a medium-sized lecture hall. However, although Shachtman and the other leaders had been willing in the 1949 to give up the pretense that they were a, quote, party, end quote, by renaming the organization the Independent Socialist League, ISL, they were still Bolshevik enough to not give up the panoply presumably appropriate to a democratic centralist group. The final break of the dissent group with the Independent Socialist League did not come until 1952. Howe and Plastrick first resigned from the Independent Socialist League. They sent a long letter explaining their point of view. It was harder for Geltman to break since he had been a Trotskyist from the beginning of his political activity and had been particularly close to Shachtman. It was several weeks before Howe and Plastrick left the Independent Socialist League before Geltman also sent a short letter of resignation. This split in the ranks of the ISL was not particularly bitter. At the first convention, after the dissent group broke away, a resolution was adopted which said that, quote, dissent is the organ of elements who desire to express their separation from the politics of third camp independent socialism, while still attempting to express a variety of, quote, leftist, end quote, or socialist opinion, end quote. And added that, quote, we do not believe that its editors can find a stable position in this area, ... end quote. However, it also said that, quote, Independent Socialist League members are free to write articles for dissent, ... end quote. The third force/Labor Party position. After the general agreement on the bureaucratic collectivism position by the Shachtmanites, they no longer devoted time to discussion of the nature of the Soviet Union. Rather, they concentrated on presentation of their third camp position on international affairs and on advocating the establishment of an independent Labor Party in the United States. These two positions were stated for the last time by a national committee of the Independent Socialist League in the Third National Convention in October 1954. Two major resolutions were adopted at that convention dealing with the third camp issue and the independent Labor Party idea. According to Labor Action's report on this convention, the third camp resolution, quote, surveyed the trend of the capitalist war camp, particularly the United States, toward an increasingly reactionary foreign policy, its inherent inability to defeat Stalinism with any progressive consequences. The illusions raised after the death of Stalin in the, quote, liberalization, end quote, of the Russian regime, the mistakes of neutralism, and many other aspects of world politics today. As against the policies of capitalist and Stalinist imperialism, which can only end in world catastrophe, the resolution develops the conceptions of genuine democracy and socialism as the means to destroy all imperialism, end quote. The convention rejected almost unanimously an amendment to support the Viet Minh. There was more disagreement concerning the League's position on international U.S. politics than on its international position. The 1951 convention of the Independent Socialist League had rejected by only one vote a move to endorse, quote, Willoughby Abner, a Negro Union leader on the Chicago South Side, end quote, who, quote, decided to fight the Democratic Party machine by running in the Democratic primaries as a labor man against the machine candidate, end quote. However, the 1954 convention accepted two amendments to party policy, adopted previously by the political committee. One stated that, quote, the convention decides that the categorical prohibition against Independent Socialist League support for such candidates under any circumstances, which was adopted in the last convention of the League, is no longer operative, end quote. The second one stated that, quote, in those instances where the participation of the trade unions in the Democratic Party has reached the point where their political activity demonstrates or controls the local functioning of that party, it is incumbent on us to argue that labor run its own labor-controlled slate of candidates in primary and general elections for both public and inter-party office, ... end quote. Movement towards unification with the socialists. This change in the ISL position on formation of an independent Labor Party reflected a general shift in the thinking and policy within the Shachtmanite ranks. The final result of this shift was the decision of the Fourth National Convention of the Independent Socialist League to end the group's existence and merge with the new Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation a merger in January 1957 of the Socialist Party and of part of the Social Democratic Federation, the organization established by the Socialist Old Guard in 1936. By early 1937, the leadership of the Independent Socialist League was oriented toward liquidating its own organization and joining the SPSDF, Socialist Party, Social Democratic Federation. Typical of their orientation at the time was a debate discussion which Shachtman had in Los Angeles with Arne Swabik of the Socialist Workers Party and Harry Sittinen of the Socialist Party. Labor Action reported on this meeting that, quote, Shachtman began his presentation with the fact that no socialist movement existed in the United States. There were, he asserted, only propaganda groups or sects. Besides these sects, which included all the groups speaking from the platform, there existed only the discredited and disgraced Communist Party, which had no future, ... end quote. The major thing differentiating the various, quote, sects, end quote, from one another, according to Shachtman, was their position on the, quote, Russian question, end quote. He insisted that since none of them was going to convince the others of the, quote, correct, end quote, position on that issue, debates over it should be put aside and they should, quote, unite into the only party which has always presented a broad, loosely defined program based on democratic socialism, the Socialist Party, which had the respect of American workers and in no way shares the disgrace of the Communist Party, end quote. The Fourth National Convention of the Independent Socialist League in July 1957 officially endorsed the idea of merger with the Socialist Social Democratic Federation, SPSDF. The convention document on unity, quote, unity and regroupment of the American socialist movement, end quote, asserted that the, quote, collapse of the Communist Party, end quote, as the result of Khrushchev's speech on the 20th Congress of the CPSU and the events in Hungary, quote, clears the way for the reconstruction of the socialist movement in the United States, for it was Stalinism through the Communist Party that dominated the radical movement for more than 20 years, end quote. The resolution proclaimed that, quote, what is required is a clearly democratic socialist pole of attraction as an alternative to Stalinism, end quote. It spelled out the Independent Socialist League's understanding that, quote, by democracy we mean the right of free speech, free press and assembly, the right to free trade unions with rights to strike, the right to form political parties and organizations free to alter the ruling regime by peaceful legal processes, end quote. The Independent Socialist League noted that of all the groups claiming to be socialist, quote, one stands out uniquely, the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation. In size, it is not larger than ours. It, however, is already broad enough in character to serve as an inclusive movement embracing a wide range of democratic socialist tendencies, ... end quote. Foreseeing one of the objections within the SPSDF ranks to merging with the Shachtmanites, the resolution proclaimed that, quote, the Independent Socialist League has neither the intention nor the desire to unite with the Socialist Party in order to capture it, for even if this were possible, such a, quote, victory, end quote, would not only be meaningless, but, what is worse, it would defeat the very objective of converting the Socialist Party from its present position of isolation and weakness to an effective, influential, broad democratic socialist movement in the best traditions of the Debs period, end quote. Unity with the SPSDF. There was considerable opposition within the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation to any kind of unity with the Shachtmanites. The author participated as a member of the SPSDF National Committee in the controversy over this question. There were two fundamental objections on the part of the opponents. One was that the Shachtmanites still remained, quote, Leninist, end quote. that is, believers in the, quote, vanguard, end quote, theory of the party and in, quote, democratic centralism, end quote. The second was that the Shachtmanites were seeking to repeat the kind of, quote, raid, end quote, on the socialists that the Trotskyites had made in 1936 to 37. Those who favored admitting the independent socialist leaguers were convinced, however, that at the least the major figures in the ISL were no longer believers in a vanguard party or, quote, democratic centralism, end quote. We were also certain that the ISL had no intention of trying either to take over or to leave the party later with as many new members as they could attract as had occurred a quarter of a century before. In fact, we were virtually sure that once in the SPSDF, the Shachtmanites would split up various ex-independent socialist leaguers, aligning themselves with the various tendencies which already existed within the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation. At its convention in mid-1958, the SPSDF finally agreed to accept the independent socialist leaguers into its ranks. However, there was to be no formal merger of the two groups. The SPSDF was only to admit the Shachtmanites as individuals, and their entry was staggered over a period of almost 6 months, with those in New York, who were the most numerous, entering only in December 1959. Finally, before the process was completed, the Shachtmanites were to close down their periodicals. There was relatively little opposition within the Independent Socialist League to dissolution into the Socialist Party SDF. However, a significant part of the League's youth organization repudiated the idea under the leadership of Tim Woolforth and James Robertson. They withdrew from the Independent Socialist League before its absorption by the Socialist Party SDF, Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation, and joined the Socialist Workers Party, the, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyist group. Subsequently, in the middle 1960s, they organized two new dissident Trotskyist groups, the Workers' League and the Spartacist League. Shachtmanites and the SPSDF. As those of us who had favored the entry of the Shachtmanites into the SPSDF had predicted, the ex-independent socialist leaguers almost immediately split into two different groups. One, headed by Shachtman himself, sided with the so-called Realignment Caucus in the SPSDF, which favored the organizations dropping independent electoral activity and working basically within the Democratic Party. The other element, known for a while as the Meyer-Mendelssohn Caucus, from Debbie Meyer and Sol Mendelssohn, sided with the so-called Debs Caucus, which supported continued running of candidates by the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation. Within a few years, the difference between Shachtmanites and, quote, old socialists, end quote, in the SP-SDF ranks lost all real meaning. There was one further reflex of Shachtmanism within the party during the 1960s. This arose from Shachtman's decision to put on sale his personal collection of internal documents of the Workers' Party and Independent Socialist League for the benefit of the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation. These materials were soon sold, and some of the most enthusiastic purchasers were the members of the Young People's Socialist League. The Young People's Socialist League not only bought up these old documents, but began to study them with considerable intensity. As a result of pursuing what Shachtman himself labeled, quote, vintage Shachtman, end quote, they began to conceive of themselves as being Leninist and, quote, very revolutionary, end quote. This development soon led them into sympathy with various Trotskyist groups, particularly the Spartacist faction, and to their becoming exceedingly critical of the, quote, adult, end quote, organization which they were affiliated, the SPSDF. The upshot of these events was the suspension of the YPSL by the Socialist Party Social Democratic Federation and the organization of a new youth group of the party with the same name. Thanks for listening.